There are moments in life when the world seems to close in around you, when every door you try to open slams shut in your face, and when the weight of everything you carry becomes almost too heavy to bear. For Clara Whitfield, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in late October, standing in the parking lot of a county courthouse in Ridgemont, Virginia, with an eviction notice crumpled in her hand and her 2 children sitting in the back seat of a car that was 3 months behind on payments. She stood there for a long time, staring at the paper as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But they didn't. They never do. The notice gave her 14 days to vacate the apartment she had called home for the past 4 years. 14 days to figure out where she and her children would sleep, where they would eat, where they would go when the world had made it very clear that there was no room left for them. Clara was 31 years old, and she had already lived through enough hardship to fill several lifetimes. She had married young, at 19, to a man named Derek, who had promised her the world and delivered nothing but broken promises and empty bottles. By the time she found the courage to leave him, she had 2 children under the age of 5, no college degree, no savings, and no family willing to take her in. Her mother had passed away when Clara was 16, and her father, a man who measured love in criticisms and disappointment, had told her plainly that she had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. Her older sister, Patricia, had married well and lived in a large house on the other side of town. But Patricia had made it abundantly clear over the years that Clara's problems were not her problems, and that the distance between them was not just geographical, but philosophical. So Clara had done what she always did. She survived. She worked 2 jobs, and sometimes 3, picking up shifts at the diner on Route 12 during the day and cleaning offices at night. She braided hair on weekends for extra cash. She clipped coupons and stretched meals and told her children, 7-year-old Elijah and 5-year-old Naya, that everything was going to be fine, even when she had no earthly idea how it would be. She told them stories at bedtime about brave heroes who overcame impossible odds, and she made sure they never saw her cry, and even though she cried more nights than she didn't. But the eviction notice was different. This wasn't a late payment she could negotiate or a utility bill she could defer. This was final. The landlord had sold the building to a developer, and every tenant had to be out by November 15th. There was no negotiation, no extension, no mercy in the language of the letter. Just cold, legal certainty. Clara sat in the car for 20 minutes before she started the engine. Elijah hung at his wide brown eyes that reminded her so much of her mother's, and she said, "Yes, baby, I'm okay." And then she drove to work, because that was what she did. She showed up. She kept going, even when going felt impossible. It was 3 days later when everything changed, though Clara wouldn't understand the magnitude of that change for quite some time. She was on her lunch break at the diner, scrolling through her phone and looking at rental listings she couldn't afford, when she received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. Normally, she would have let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. On the other end was a woman named Helen Marsh, an attorney from a small firm in Boone County, West Virginia, a place Clara had never been and had no connection to as far as she knew. Helen Marsh explained that she was handling the estate of a man named Arthur Redmond, who had passed away 6 weeks earlier at the age of 89. Arthur Redmond had no surviving spouse, no children, and no close family to speak of. He had, however, left behind a will, and in that will, he had bequeathed his property, a cabin on 40 acres of land in the mountains of Boone County, unto the daughter of Margaret Ellen Whitfield, Clara's mother. Clara nearly dropped the phone. She hadn't heard her mother's full name spoken aloud in years, and hearing it from a stranger's mouth sent a jolt through her chest that felt like electricity. She asked Helen Marsh to repeat herself, and Helen did, patiently and clearly. Arthur Redmond had known Clara's mother decades ago, before Clara was born, when Margaret had spent a summer working at a general store in the mountains. Sir Arthur had been a regular customer, a quiet man who lived alone and kept to himself, and he and Margaret had formed an unlikely friendship. When Margaret left at the end of that summer, they had stayed in touch through letters for a few years before life carried them in different directions. But Arthur had never forgotten her kindness, and when he sat down to write his will, with no family of his own to leave anything to, he had remembered Margaret and tracked down her descendants. The property, Helen explained, was modest. A cabin built in the 1940s, sitting on land that had been in Arthur's family for generations. It hadn't been occupied in several years, and Helen was honest about the fact that it was in rough shape. The county had assessed the property at $800, which told Clara everything she needed to know about its condition. $800 for a cabin and 40 acres of land meant that the land was remote. The cabin was falling apart, but nobody in their right mind wanted either one. Clara thanked Helen Marsh and said she would think about it. She hung up the phone and sat there in the break room of the diner, staring at the wall, trying to process what she had just heard. A cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, $800. A dead man she had never met who had known her mother 30 years ago. It sounded like the beginning of a joke, or maybe the beginning of a tragedy. She wasn't sure which. That night, after the kids were in bed, Clara called her sister Patricia. She told her about the phone call, about Arthur Redmond, about the cabin. Patricia's response was immediate and cutting. She laughed. Not a small laugh either, but a full, condescending laugh that carried all the weight of every judgment Patricia had ever passed on Clara's life. An $800 cabin in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, Patricia said, and Clara could hear her shaking her head through the phone. Clara, please tell me you're not actually considering this. You're about to be homeless, and you're chasing some dead man's shack in the woods? This is exactly your problem. You never think things through. You just jump from one disaster to the next. Clara tried to explain that she wasn't jumping into anything, that she was just exploring her options. But Patricia wasn't interested in listening. She had already formed her opinion, and her opinion was that Clara was foolish, and that the cabin was worthless, and that Clara should focus on finding a real solution to her real problems instead of chasing fantasies. Nobody leaves anything worth having to a stranger, Patricia said. If that cabin was worth anything, he would have sold it himself. Use your head, Clara. The conversation ended the way most of their conversations ended, with Patricia offering advice that felt more like criticism, and Clara hanging up feeling smaller than she had before she called. But something about Patricia's dismissal had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of discouraging Clara, it lit something inside her. A quiet defiance, a stubborn spark that had kept her going through every other impossible situation she had faced. The next morning, Clara called Helen Marsh back and said she would accept the inheritance. The paperwork took about a week to process. Helen Marsh was efficient and kind, and walking Clara through every document and every signature with patience that Clara wasn't used to receiving from professionals. When it was done, Clara was the legal owner of a cabin and 40 acres of land in the mountains of Boone County, West Virginia. She had never owned anything in her life, not a house, not land, not even the car she drove, which technically belonged to the financing company. And now she owned a cabin, an $800 cabin that nobody wanted, on land that nobody cared about, in a place that nobody visited. She told a few people at work about it, casually, not making a big deal of it. The reactions were universally discouraging. Her coworker Brenda at the diner said it sounded like a money pit. Her boss, Gary, said he wouldn't take a free cabin in West Virginia if you paid him. Even the woman at the laundromat, who Clara barely knew, overheard her talking about it on the phone and said, "Honey, those mountain cabins are nothing but trouble. Mold, termites, no plumbing. You'd be better off in a tent." Clara absorbed all of this quietly. She was used to people telling her what she couldn't do, what wouldn't work, what was a bad idea. She had been hearing it her whole life, from her father, from her ex-husband, from her sister, from strangers who felt entitled to opinions about her choices. And maybe they were right. Maybe the cabin was worthless. Maybe she was foolish for accepting it. But she was also about to be evicted, and she had 2 children who needed a roof over their heads, and an $800 cabin in the mountains was still a cabin. It was still a roof. It was still something. On the first Saturday in November, Clara loaded her children into the car and drove 4 hours west to Boone County to see the property for the first time. The drive took her through rolling hills that turned into mountains, through small towns that got smaller and smaller until they were barely towns at all, through winding roads that climbed higher and higher until the air itself felt different, thinner and cleaner, and carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that branched off a county road that branched off a state highway, each turn taking her further from civilization and deeper into a landscape that felt both beautiful and impossibly remote. When she finally pulled up to the property, she sat in the car for a long moment, taking it in. The cabin was exactly what she had expected, and worse. It was a single-story structure, maybe 900 square feet, built from logs that had darkened with age to the color of burnt coffee. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old spine. One of the front windows was broken, covered with a piece of plywood that had warped and pulled away from the frame. The porch, which must have been charming once, now leaned to the left at an angle that suggested it was one strong wind away from collapsing entirely. Weeds and wildflowers had overtaken the yard, growing waist-high in some places, and a massive oak tree near the side of the cabin had dropped a limb onto the roof at some point, leaving a visible dent in the tin. "Is this our new house?" Naya asked from the back seat, her voice carrying the innocent curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to judge things by their appearance. "We're just visiting today, baby," Clara said. But even as she said it, she felt something stir in her chest. Not excitement, exactly. Not hope. Something more like recognition. Like the cabin, despite its obvious flaws, was waiting for her. Like it had been waiting for a long time. She got the children out of the car, and they walked up to the porch together, untesting each step before putting their full weight on it. The front door was locked, but Helen Marsh had mailed Clara a set of keys, and after some effort with a lock that was stiff with age and rust, the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty rooms. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood, and something faintly sweet that Clara couldn't identify. The main room was larger than she expected, with a stone fireplace on one wall that rose from floor to ceiling, built from river rocks that had been fitted together with obvious care. The kitchen was small but functional, with a cast-iron sink and wooden counters that had been worn smooth by decades of use. There were 2 bedrooms in the back, both small, both empty, both with windows that looked out into a forest so dense and green it felt like looking into another world. But it was the attic that caught Clara's attention. She noticed the hatch in the ceiling of the hallway almost immediately, on a square panel set into the wooden planks above, with a small metal ring pulled that had been painted over so many times it was barely visible. It was a detail that most people would have overlooked, but Clara had spent years cleaning other people's houses and offices, and she had developed an eye for things that were hidden in plain sight. "What's up there?" Elijah asked, pointing at the hatch. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "We'll find out." But she didn't open it that day. Saw the attic could wait. First, she needed to assess the basics. She walked through every room, testing light switches that didn't work, turning faucet handles that produced nothing but a hollow groan from somewhere in the walls, opening closets and cabinets that were empty except for dust and the occasional spider web. The cabin had been without power and water for years. That much was obvious. But the bones of the place were solid. The log walls were thick and sturdy. The floor didn't buckle under her feet. And the fireplace, when she peered up into the chimney, showed a clear channel to the sky above. On the drive home that evening, with both children asleep in the back seat, Clara made her decision. She would move into the cabin. She would fix it up, get the power and water turned on, and make it livable. It wasn't ideal. It was hours from the town where she worked, in a place where she knew no one, with no guarantee of employment or support. But it was hers. It was the first thing in her entire life that belonged to her, that no landlord could take away, that no bank could repossess, that no ex-husband could claim. It was hers, and she was going to fight for it. The move happened in stages over the next 2 weeks. Clara packed what little she owned into garbage bags and cardboard boxes, loaded them into her car in trips, and drove them to the cabin. She enrolled the children in the small elementary school in the nearest town, and a place called Meadow Creek that had a population of about 400 people, and a main street that consisted of a post office, a general store, a church, and a gas station. She found a job at the general store, which didn't pay much, but was close enough to the cabin that she could get there and back without spending half her paycheck on gas. The first few weeks at the cabin were brutal. Without running water, Clara hauled buckets from a creek that ran along the edge of the property. Without heat, she burned wood in the fireplace and piled every blanket she owned onto the children's beds. Without electricity, she used candles and a battery-powered lantern that she had bought at a thrift store for $3. The children adapted with the remarkable resilience that children possess, treating the whole thing like an adventure. But Clara knew the truth. She was one bad day away from disaster, and the margin between survival and catastrophe was thinner than it had ever been. And word traveled fast in a small community like Meadow Creek, and it didn't take long for the locals to learn that someone had moved into old Arthur Redmond's cabin. The reactions were mixed, but leaned heavily toward skepticism. Arthur had been a recluse, known around town as a strange old man who kept to himself, rarely came into town, and hadn't had a visitor in years before he died. His cabin had been considered an eyesore for as long as anyone could remember, and the general consensus was that it should have been torn down years ago. "You're living up at the Redmond place?" asked Earl, the man who ran the gas station. He said it with the kind of incredulous amusement that people reserve for decisions they consider spectacularly misguided. "That old shack, lady, I wouldn't keep my dogs up there." Clara smiled and said it was coming along, which was technically true. Even if coming along meant she had swept the floors and patched the broken window with plastic sheeting and duct tape. At the general store, her boss, a woman named Dorothy, who had lived in Meadow Creek her entire life, was slightly more sympathetic, but equally doubtful. "Arthur was a peculiar man," Dorothy said, folding shirts behind the counter. "Kept to himself all those years. Never married, never had anybody come around. Folks used to wonder what he did up there all alone. Some said he was just odd. Others said he was hiding something. But I figure if he had anything worth hiding, he would have done something about it before he died, wouldn't he?" Clara didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't try. She just worked her shifts, cashed her paychecks, and put every spare dollar toward making the cabin livable. She called the power company and arranged to have the electricity turned on, which required a new meter and some rewiring that cost her nearly everything she had saved. She called a plumber in the next town over, who agreed to look at the water situation for a reduced rate, because Clara reminded him of his daughter, or so he said. The plumber found that the well pump had burned out years ago, and the pipes had frozen and burst in several places. Fixing it would cost more than Clara could afford, and so she settled for a temporary solution involving a garden hose run from the creek through a filter system she had cobbled together from YouTube tutorials and hardware store supplies. It was primitive. It was exhausting. And every day, someone had something to say about it. Patricia called once a week, ostensibly to check in, but really to remind Clara of how foolish she was being. "You're living like a pioneer woman in the 21st century, Patricia said during one call. "Look, you have 2 children, Clara. They deserve better than this." "They deserve a mother who doesn't give up," Clara said, and Patricia went quiet for a moment before changing the subject. Her father called once, shortly after learning about the move from Patricia. His message was characteristically blunt. "You inherited a dead man's shack," he said. "That's not a fresh start. That's a dead end. But you never did listen to anyone, did you?" Even Derek, her ex-husband, would have his lawyer look into custody, would have his lawyer look into custody. This from a man who hadn't paid child support in over a year and whose current address was a friend's couch. Clara didn't respond to the text. She had learned a long time ago that engaging with Derek only gave him power he hadn't earned. Through all of it, Clara kept working. She patched the roof with tar paper and roofing cement she found on sale at the hardware store. She reinforced the porch with lumber she salvaged from a barn that had collapsed on the back of the property. She cleaned every surface, scrubbed every wall, and slowly, inch by inch, turned the cabin from a neglected ruin into something that resembled a home. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it was warm and dry and safe. And when she sat by the fireplace at night after the children were asleep, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she belonged somewhere. It was during the 3rd week, while Clara was in the process of cleaning out a closet in the back bedroom, that she found the first clue. Tucked behind a loose baseboard, barely visible unless you were on your hands and knees with a flashlight, was a small leather notebook. It was old, the leather cracked and dry, the pages yellowed and brittle. But the handwriting inside was clear and precise, written in a steady hand that belonged to someone who took care with words. The notebook belonged to Arthur Redmond. That much was obvious from the name written inside the front cover in faded blue ink. But the contents were unexpected. It wasn't a diary, exactly, or a journal. It was more like a record. Page after page of entries, each one dated, each one describing an item. A painting, a pocket watch, a set of coins, a bundle of letters. Each entry included a description of the item, where Arthur had acquired it, and a number that Clara initially assumed was a catalog number of some kind, but eventually realized was a value, an estimated monetary value. The numbers were small at first, $50 here, $100 there. But as Clara turned the pages, moving forward through the years, the numbers grew. 500, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. The entries became more detailed, the descriptions more precise, and the values climbed steadily higher until Clara reached a section near the middle of the notebook where the entries stopped using individual dollar amounts and instead referenced something called the collection, with a notation that read, "See attic inventory. Full assessment pending." Clara's heart began to beat faster. She read the entry again, then a 3rd time, making sure she wasn't misunderstanding. The attic, the collection, full assessment pending. She looked up at the ceiling, toward the hallway where the attic hatch waited, and felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the cabin walls. She set the notebook down carefully, as if it were made of glass, and walked to the hallway. She stood beneath the hatch and looked up at it for a long time. The metal ring pull stared back at her like an eye, daring her to reach for it. She had meant to open the attic weeks ago, had thought about it every day since her first visit, but somehow there had always been something more urgent to deal with. The roof, the water, the electricity, the children's school enrollment, the job. Life had kept her busy, and the attic had waited patiently. But now, with Arthur's notebook in her hand, and his careful handwriting describing a collection that he had spent a lifetime building, the attic felt different. For the ring pull, her fingers closing for the ring pull, her fingers closing around the cold metal. She pulled, and the hatch resisted for a moment before giving way with a groan of old hinges. A folding ladder, the kind that telescopes down from attic hatches, descended toward her in a cloud of dust that made her eyes water and her throat tighten. The ladder was wooden, old but solid, and when Clara tested the first rung with her weight, it held firm. She climbed. The attic was dark, lit only by the thin gray light that filtered through a small window at the far end, a window so covered in grime and cobwebs that it barely let any light through at all. Clara pulled herself up through the hatch and stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The air up here was different from the rest of the cabin. It was cooler, drier, and carried a smell that was less like neglect and more like preservation, like a museum, like a place where things had been stored, not carelessly, but deliberately. As her eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Boxes, stacks of them, neatly arranged along the walls. Old wooden crates, the kind that might have been used to ship goods a century ago, with faded stenciling on their sides that she couldn't quite make out. There were trunks, too. Large, heavy-looking trunks with brass fittings and leather straps, the kind of things you see in antique shops or old photographs. And in the center of the attic, sitting alone on a small wooden table like a shrine, was something that made Clara stop in her tracks. A safe, not a modern safe, with a digital keypad and an electronic lock. An old safe, a serious safe. It was made of heavy steel, painted black, with a combination dial on the front, and a handle that looked like it belonged on the door of a bank vault. It was maybe 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, and it sat on that table with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting to be found. Clara stared at it. She stared at it for a long time, her mind racing through a dozen thoughts at once. She thought about Arthur Redmond and his notebook full of entries. She thought about the values he had recorded, the numbers that had grown larger and larger with each passing year. She thought about his quiet life in this cabin, alone for decades, visited by no one, known by few, dismissed by most as just another eccentric old man in the mountains. And she thought about the attic hatch, painted over so many times it was nearly invisible, and the collection that Arthur had referenced in his notebook, and the assessment that was still pending. Clara reached out and touched the safe. The metal was cold under her fingers, solid, real. She turned the combination dial experimentally, and it moved smoothly, silently, with the precision of something that had been well maintained. But she didn't know the combination. She didn't have the numbers. And standing in the dark attic of a dead man's cabin, with dust motes floating in the thin light around her, she realized that this was not something she could rush. This was not something she could force. And this was something that required patience and care and the kind of deliberate attention that Arthur Redmond himself seemed to have practiced his entire life. She climbed back down the ladder, folded it up, and closed the hatch. Then she picked up Arthur's notebook and sat down at the kitchen table and began to read it again. From the beginning, more carefully this time, looking for something she might have missed. A clue. A pattern. A combination hidden somewhere in the careful handwriting of a man who had trusted her mother enough to leave his entire life's work to her daughter. Outside, the wind picked up, sending a shower of leaves against the cabin windows. Inside, Clara turned the pages one by one, and the story of Arthur Redmond and his hidden collection began to unfold. She didn't know it yet, standing in that small kitchen with candlelight flickering on the walls. But she was holding in her hands the key to a fortune that would change not just her life, but the lives of her children and everyone who had ever doubted her. She didn't know that the safe in the attic contained something worth more than $200 million, or that the boxes and crates stacked along the attic walls held treasures that collectors and museums and auction houses would fight over for years to come. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she had a roof over her head, her children were sleeping safely in the next room, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn, as she always did. She made coffee on the propane stove she had bought secondhand, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat on the porch, watching the sun come up over the mountains. The sky turned from black to deep blue to orange to gold, and the forest around the cabin came alive with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures beginning their day. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful that it hurt, the way beauty sometimes does when you've gone too long without it. She had spent most of the previous night reading Arthur's notebook, and she had found something. Not the combination to the safe, not exactly, but a reference to it. Near the back of the notebook, in an entry dated just 2 years before Arthur's death, he had written a short paragraph that read differently from the rest. It was less like a catalog entry and more like a letter, addressed to no one in particular, but written with the intimacy of someone speaking to a person they trusted. "If you're reading this," the entry said, "then I am gone, and you have found what I left behind. The answers you seek are in the places where Margaret's kindness touched my life. The first letter she wrote me, the date she visited the store, the number of wildflowers she brought the old man who had forgotten what beauty looked like. These are the numbers. These are the keys. Trust them, as I trusted her." Clara read that paragraph over and over, turning each phrase in her mind like a puzzle piece. The first letter Margaret wrote, the date she visited the store, the number of wildflowers. These were specific references to specific moments in the friendship between Arthur and Clara's mother, moments that Clara didn't know about, because her mother had died when Clara was 16 and had never mentioned Arthur Redmond or a summer spent in the mountains of West Virginia. But somewhere, Clara thought, there might be answers. Her mother had been a letter writer. She had kept correspondence the way other people kept photographs, bundling them in ribbon and storing them in boxes. When Margaret died, most of her belongings had been distributed among family members or donated to charity. But Clara had kept a few things: a box of letters, a recipe book, a Bible with notes in the margins. These items were in a storage unit back in Ridgemont, one of the few things Clara hadn't been forced to sell or leave behind. She needed those letters. She needed to find out what Arthur's notebook was referring to. She needed the combination to that safe. But first, she needed to get through the day. She needed to get the children to school, get herself to work, smile at customers, and stock shelves, and pretend that everything was normal, while her mind buzzed with the knowledge that something extraordinary might be waiting for her in the attic of her cabin. And so that's what she did. She got through the day. She smiled and worked and drove and cooked and tucked her children into bed. And then, when the house was quiet and the fire was burning low, she sat down and began to plan her next move. She would drive back to Ridgemont. She would get her mother's letters from storage, and she would find the answers that Arthur had hidden in his notebook. and she would open that safe. She didn't tell anyone about the notebook. She didn't tell anyone about the safe. She didn't tell Patricia or her father or Dorothy at the general store or Earl at the gas station. This was hers. This moment. This mystery. This fragile thread of possibility that connected her to a mother she had lost, and a stranger who had remembered her mother's kindness across 3 decades of solitude. Clara fell asleep that night with the notebook under her pillow and the sound of the winds in the pines outside her window, and a feeling in her chest that she barely recognized because it had been absent from her life for so long. It was hope. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and anticipation. Clara went to work, came home, fed the children, helped Elijah with his homework, and Naya with her drawings, and tried not to think about the attic every waking moment. So even though that was exactly what she was doing. The safe sat above her like a heartbeat she couldn't ignore, pulsing through the ceiling, reminding her with every creak of the old house that something was up there, waiting. On Thursday, Dorothy at the general store noticed that Clara seemed distracted. "You feeling all right, hon?" she asked, peering at Clara over the reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. "You've been staring at that same shelf for 5 minutes." Clara apologized and said she hadn't been sleeping well, which was true. She hadn't been sleeping well because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the safe, black and heavy and patient, and she heard Arthur's words in her head. The first letter she wrote me, the date she visited the store, the number of wildflowers. The phrases circled through her thoughts like birds that wouldn't land, and she turned them over and over, trying to extract meaning from them without the context she needed. On Friday afternoon, she asked Dorothy if she could have Saturday off. Dorothy looked surprised because Clara had never asked for a day off before, not once in the 6 weeks she had been working there. But Dorothy said yes, of course, and Clara thanked her and went home to prepare. She called the storage facility in Ridgemont and confirmed that her unit was still active. She had been paying the monthly fee, $29, even when she could barely afford it, because the things inside that unit were the last physical connections she had to her mother. Letters, recipes, a Bible, a few photographs, things that had no monetary value to anyone else, but were priceless to Clara. And now, possibly, they held the key to something else entirely. Saturday morning, Clara woke at 4 a.m. She dressed in the dark, left a note for the children with instructions to stay inside and eat the breakfast she had prepared the night before, and drove east toward Ridgemont. The drive was 4 hours, and she spent every minute of it thinking about her mother, about Margaret Ellen Whitfield, who had died too young and too quietly, whose life had been full of small kindnesses that Clara was only now beginning to understand the reach of. A summer in the mountains, a friendship with a lonely man, on letters written and sent across the years, wildflowers brought to someone who had forgotten what beauty looked like. Clara arrived at the storage facility just after 8 a.m. The manager, a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt who remembered her from years of monthly payments, let her in and wished her well. She walked down the narrow corridor between rows of identical metal doors until she reached Unit 47. She unlocked it, rolled up the door, and stepped inside. The unit was small, maybe 5 by 5, and contained exactly what she remembered. 3 cardboard boxes, a suitcase that had belonged to her mother, and a plastic bin full of kitchen items she hadn't had room for in the cabin. Clara went straight to the box labeled Mom's Letters in her own handwriting and carried it to the car. She didn't open it there. She didn't want to read those letters in a storage facility parking lot. She wanted to read them at home, in the cabin, by the fire, where Arthur had lived and where her mother's kindness had apparently reached across decades to bring Clara to this moment. The drive home felt longer than the drive out, and by the time Clara pulled up to the cabin, The children were playing in the yard, tossing a ball back and forth in the pale November sunlight. They ran to her when they saw the car, and she hugged them both and carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara opened the box. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, stacked neatly on top of one another. Some were letters her mother had received. Some were copies her mother had made of letters she had sent. And there, near the bottom of the box, tied with a piece of blue ribbon that had gone almost white with age, was a bundle labeled in her mother's handwriting. Arthur. Summer of '88. Clara's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. The letters smelled like lavender and old paper, that particular combination of scents that only comes from things that have been stored away for decades by someone who cared enough to preserve them. Clara spread them out on the kitchen table, her fingers moving carefully, reverently, the way you handle things that are fragile, not because they might break, but because they carry the weight of someone who is no longer here to explain them. There were 11 letters in total, but 7 were written by her mother, in the looping, generous handwriting that Clara remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists and notes tucked into lunchboxes. 4 were written by Arthur, in the same precise, careful hand that filled the leather notebook she had found behind the baseboard. The letters were arranged in order, the earliest dated June 14th, 1988. The last dated September 3rd, 1988. A summer. An entire friendship, captured in ink and paper across a single summer when Clara's mother had been 19 years old and working at a general store in the mountains of West Virginia. Clara picked up the first letter. It was dated June 14th, 1988, and it was written by her mother. The opening line read, "Dear Mr. Redmond, I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I know we only spoke briefly at the store today, but you seemed like someone who might appreciate a letter." Clara read it slowly, savoring each word. Store, about the mountains, about how she store, about the mountains, about how she had come from Ridgemont for the summer to work and save money for college. She wrote about the wildflowers she had seen growing along the road on her walk home, and how she had picked a handful of them because they were too beautiful to leave standing alone where nobody would see them. She wrote that she had brought some of those wildflowers to the store and left them in a jar on the counter, and she hoped Mr. Redmond had noticed them when he came in for his groceries. The letter was simple and kind and full of the quiet warmth that Clara remembered as her mother's defining quality. Margaret had been the kind of person who noticed people, so not just looked at them, but actually noticed them, the way they held themselves, the things they didn't say, the loneliness they carried like an invisible weight. She had noticed Arthur Redmond, a man who came into the store once a week, always alone, always quiet, and she had reached out to him in the only way she knew how, with words, with flowers, with attention. Arthur's reply, dated June 20th, 1988, was shorter but equally revealing. He thanked Margaret for the letter. He said he had indeed noticed the wildflowers, and that they were the first flowers anyone had brought into his life in more years than he could remember. He wrote that he lived alone on a property in the hills above Meadow Creek, and that the solitude suited him most days, but some days it didn't, and those were the days when a letter from a kind stranger felt like a window opening in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. Clara kept reading. The letters moved back and forth between Margaret and Arthur across the summer of 1988, building a friendship that was gentle and honest and completely devoid of pretense. Margaret wrote about her life in Ridgemont, her hopes for college, her love of books and music. Arthur wrote about his life on the mountain, his collections, his belief that beautiful things deserved to be preserved because the world had a tendency to forget what mattered. He mentioned, in one letter, dated July 22nd, that he had spent the past 30 years assembling what he called a record of human craftsmanship, and that most of the items in his collection had been acquired not for their monetary value, but for their beauty and the stories they told. In another letter, dated August 8th, Arthur described a set of stamps he had recently acquired from an estate sale in Charleston. They were Confederate-era stamps, he wrote, extremely rare. And they had been tucked inside a family Bible that the estate sale organizers had priced at $2. Arthur had bought the Bible for the stamps, but he had kept the Bible too, because it contained handwritten records of births and deaths and marriages going back to 1843, and he felt that those records deserved to exist somewhere safe rather than being tossed in a landfill with the rest of the estate's unsold items. That letter stopped Clara. She read it twice, but then set it down and picked up Arthur's notebook, flipping to the entries near the middle where the values had grown large enough to reference the collection. She found an entry dated August 1988 that read, Confederate Provisionals, 12 specimens, acquired Charleston estate. Assessment, significant. No dollar amount, just the word significant, underlined twice. Clara's pulse quickened. She returned to the letters. The friendship between Margaret and Arthur deepened through August. But Margaret visited him at the cabin twice, once on August 3rd and once on August 17th. In a letter following the first visit, Margaret described the cabin as the most peaceful place I've ever been, and mentioned that Arthur had shown her some of his collection, though she confessed she didn't fully understand the value of what she was seeing. He has these old coins in velvet cases, she wrote, and stamps and albums that he handles like they're made of spun glass, and paintings that he keeps in climate-controlled cases he built himself out of cedar wood and glass. I don't know what any of it is worth, but I know it makes him happy, and that seems like enough. The second visit, on August 17th, was the one that gave Clara what she needed. In a letter dated August 19th, Margaret described bringing Arthur a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the meadow near the creek. I brought him 23 wildflowers, Margaret wrote. I counted them because he once told me that he was a man who valued precision, and I wanted him to know that I listened. He put them in a mason jar on the kitchen table and stared at them for the longest time. And when I asked if he was all right, he said he was better than all right. He was remembering what beauty looked like. Clara set the letter down and closed her eyes. The number of wildflowers she brought the old man, who had forgotten what beauty looked like. 23. She opened the notebook to Arthur's cryptic message and read it again. The first letter she wrote me, the date she visited the store, the number of wildflowers she brought the old man who had forgotten what beauty looked like. These are the numbers. These are the keys. The first letter Margaret wrote was dated June 14th. The date could mean the number 14, or the month and day, or just the day itself. Clara considered the possibilities, and turning them over in her mind like combination numbers on a dial. The date she visited the store. Margaret had worked at the general store, so she would have been there almost every day. But the phrasing was specific. The date she visited the store, not worked at the store. Visited. That meant a particular visit, a notable one. Clara searched the letters for a reference and found it in Arthur's reply to the first letter. Thank you for speaking to me when you came into the store on June 9th, he wrote. Most people don't bother with old men who buy the same groceries every week. June 9th. The 9th. Clara now had 3 numbers, 14, 9, 23. She sat still for a moment, the numbers burning in her mind like embers. Then she stood up, took a candle from the shelf, and walked to the hallway. She placed the chair beneath the attic hatch, climbed up, pulled the ring, and ascended the ladder into the darkness above. The attic was exactly as she had left it. The boxes stacked against the walls, the trunks with their brass fittings gleaming faintly in the candlelight. And in the center, sitting on its wooden table with the patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment, the safe. Clara set the candle on a crate beside the table and stood before the safe. The combination dial stared at her on a circle of small white numbers against a black face. She reached out and took hold of the dial with her right hand. It was smooth and cool, and turned with the same silky precision she remembered from her first visit. She turned the dial to the right. 14. She turned it to the left, past 0, to 9. She turned it back to the right, to 23. For a moment, nothing happened. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, and she wondered if she had the numbers wrong, or if she had misunderstood Arthur's clue, if the whole thing was just an old man's rambling note, and the safe was empty, or welded shut, or beyond her ability to open. She gripped the handle and pulled. The safe opened. The door swung toward her with a soft, heavy smoothness that spoke of quality engineering, the kind of mechanism that was built to last 100 years and would probably last 200. And inside, illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle in the attic of a forgotten cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, Clara saw what Arthur Redmond had spent 60 years of his life assembling. The safe had 3 shelves, each one lined with dark green felt. On the top shelf, arranged in neat rows inside individual protective sleeves, were stamps, dozens of them, maybe 100. Clara didn't know anything about stamps. Suggested they were worth far more than suggested. They were worth far more than the paper they were printed on. Each sleeve was labeled in Arthur's handwriting with a date, a description, and a code that Clara assumed corresponded to entries in his notebook. On the middle shelf were coins, not a pile of coins, not a jumble thrown into a box, but individual coins, each one housed in its own clear plastic case, each case labeled with the same meticulous notation as the stamps. There were gold coins and silver coins and copper coins, some so old that the images on their faces had worn smooth. Clara picked up one of the cases and held it close to the candle. The coin inside was gold, heavy even through the plastic, and the label on the case read, 1933. Double Eagle. St. Gaudens. One of 20 known specimens. Clara didn't know what a 1933 Double Eagle was. She didn't know that only 20 were known to exist. She didn't know that a single specimen of this coin had sold at auction for more than $18 million. She didn't know any of that yet. But she knew, holding that coin in her trembling hand, that she was looking at something extraordinary. She knew it the way you know certain things without being told, for the way you know that a storm is coming by the color of the sky, the way you know that a person is telling the truth by the steadiness of their voice. She knew. On the bottom shelf were documents, bundles of papers tied with twine, each bundle enclosed in an acid-free archival folder. Clara carefully lifted one folder and opened it. Inside were handwritten letters, very old, on paper that was yellowed and fragile, but perfectly preserved. The handwriting was not Arthur's, and not her mother's. Go folder toward the candlelight, and read the folder toward the candlelight, and read the first line of the top letter. My dear General, I write to you in haste from the fields outside Gettysburg. Clara closed the folder with shaking hands and placed it back on the shelf. She didn't need to read any more of that letter to understand what she was holding. She didn't need to be a historian or a collector or an expert to know that a handwritten letter from the Civil War, addressed to a general, written from the fields of Gettysburg, was the kind of document that belonged in a museum and was worth more money than she could comprehend. She stepped back from the safe and looked at it. All 3 shelves, the stamps in their sleeves, the coins in their cases, the documents in their archival folders. 60 years of collecting. and 60 years of patience and knowledge and quiet acquisition by a man who lived alone in a cabin on a mountain and was dismissed by his neighbors as eccentric and strange and possibly touched in the head. A man who had looked at the world and seen beauty where others saw junk, who had attended estate sales and auctions and antique shops and had recognized value that no one else could see, and who had carried his treasures home to this cabin and stored them in this safe and kept them secret from everyone except, apparently, a 19-year-old girl who brought him wildflowers and wrote him letters and treated him like a human being. Clara sat down on the attic floor. She sat there for a long time, surrounded by the boxes and crates and trunks she hadn't even opened yet, with the safe standing open before her like a door into a life she couldn't quite believe was hers. She didn't cry, though she came close. She didn't laugh, though the absurdity of it, of standing in a dead man's attic in the middle of the night with a candle and a fortune, was not lost on her. What she did was sit and breathe and try to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. She thought about the number she didn't know yet, but could feel, the way you feel the depth of a lake by the color of the water. She thought about Arthur's notebook and the escalating values and the entry that simply said, significant, underlined twice. She thought about the boxes along the walls, still unopened, and the trunks with their brass fittings, and the fact that the safe was only part of it. The safe was the centerpiece, yes, but the attic was full, and Arthur had been collecting for 6 decades, and everything she had seen so far suggested that he was not a man who accumulated junk. Eventually, Clara stood up. At the letters spread out before her, at the letters spread out before her, her mother's handwriting mingling with Arthur's, and she made a decision. She would not tell anyone, not yet. She didn't know what she had, not really, not in terms of specific value, and she didn't want to say anything until she understood. And she had been poor her entire life, and poverty had taught her that hope was dangerous when it was premature. It was better to know, to be certain, before she opened her mouth and invited the world's opinions into something that was still fragile and private, and hers. The next morning was a Sunday. Clara took the children to the small church in Meadow Creek, not because she was particularly religious, but because Elijah had asked if they could go after hearing some kids at school talk about their Sunday school class. The church was small, white clapboard, with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and the congregation was maybe 30 people, most of them over 60. They were welcoming in the way that small-town church people tend to be, which meant warm handshakes and gentle curiosity, and a few too many questions about where she was from and how long she planned to stay. After the service, Clara drove to the next town over, where there was a library with internet access. She left the children in the kids section with strict instructions to read and not wander, and she sat down at one of the public computers and began to search. She started with the coins. She typed 1933 Double Eagle St. Gaudens into the search bar and watched the results populate the screen. The first result was a Wikipedia article. The second was a news story from an auction house. The third was a collector's forum. Clara clicked on the news story first. The article described the sale of a 1933 Double Eagle gold coin at a Sotheby's auction. The coin had been one of only 20 known specimens, most of which were held by the United States government. The sale price was $18.9 million. Clara read the number 3 times. Then she read the article. Then she read it again. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against the desk to make them stop. $18.9 million. For one coin. And Arthur's safe had contained not one, but several coins in individual cases, each one labeled with the same careful precision. She searched for the stamps next. My Confederate provisional stamps value led her down a rabbit hole of philatelic history that she could barely follow. But the numbers she found were staggering. Rare Confederate stamps, depending on condition and provenance, could sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars apiece. Some specimens had sold for over $1 million, and Arthur had described his as 12 specimens, plural, with an assessment of significant. The documents were harder to research without knowing exactly what they were, but Clara found enough to understand that handwritten Civil War correspondence, particularly letters from or to high-ranking officers, particularly letters written from significant battlefields like Gettysburg, were among the most valuable categories of historical documents in the world. Individual letters had sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Collections of related letters, especially if they contained historically significant information, could sell for millions. Or Clara leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights of the library hummed above her, and somewhere nearby, a child was whispering to another child. And the world was going on, as it always did, oblivious and ordinary, while Clara sat in a small-town library in West Virginia and tried to comprehend the fact that she might be in possession of a fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. Possibly more. Possibly much, much more, depending on what was in those boxes and crates and trunks she hadn't opened yet. She didn't tell the children. She drove them home and made dinner, and helped with homework and read bedtime stories, and went through all the motions of a normal Sunday evening, while her mind raced with numbers and possibilities, and a growing, terrifying sense that her life was about to change in ways she wasn't prepared for. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara climbed into the attic again. This time, she brought a flashlight and a notepad and a pen, and she began to inventory the room. Not the safe, which she left closed, but the boxes and crates and trunks that lined the walls. She started with the nearest box, a cardboard filing box, the kind you buy at an office supply store. Inside were albums, stamp albums, the pages enclosed in protective mylar sheets, each stamp mounted and labeled. She counted the albums. There were 14 in that box alone. She opened one at random and found page after page of stamps that, even to her untrained eye, looked old and rare and valuable. She didn't try to assess them. She just counted them and made a note on her pad and moved to the next box. The next box contained more albums, these ones larger, the kind used for photographs, but adapted for documents. Inside were letters, receipts, certificates, and other paper ephemera, spanning what appeared to be 2 centuries of American history. Clara handled them as carefully as she could, turning pages slowly, afraid that the oils on her fingers might damage something irreplaceable. The trunks were heavier and harder to open. The first one she managed to unlatch contained paintings. Small paintings, none larger than a dinner plate, each one wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and nestled in custom-fitted foam. They were portraits, mostly, and landscapes, rendered in oils with the kind of skill that Clara, who knew nothing about art, nor could nevertheless recognize as exceptional. One painting in particular caught her eye, a small portrait of a woman in a blue dress, no bigger than a paperback book, painted with such delicacy and life that the woman seemed about to speak. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written a name and a date. The name was unfamiliar. The date was 1847. Clara moved through the attic methodically, opening boxes and crates and trunks, counting items, making notes, and trying to catalog what she was seeing without understanding the full scope of it. She worked for 3 hours until her flashlight began to dim and her fingers were stiff from the cold, and by the time she climbed back down, she had filled 4 pages of her notepad with entries. 14 stamp albums, each containing between 50 and 200 specimens. 8 document folders in the safe, plus another 23 in the filing boxes along the walls, 11 paintings in the first trunk. She hadn't opened the second or third trunk. She hadn't opened the wooden crates with the faded stenciling. She hadn't cataloged the coins in the safe beyond the double eagle she had examined. She had barely scratched the surface, and already the scale of what Arthur had assembled was beyond anything she had imagined. On Monday morning, Clara went to the library again during her lunch break. She searched for How to Get Antiques, Appraised, and Rare Stamp Appraisal, and Historical Document Authentication. The results led her to several possibilities, but one name kept appearing across multiple searches. A firm based in Washington, D.C., that specialized in the authentication and appraisal of rare stamps, coins, historical documents, and fine art. The firm had been in business since 1952 and had handled some of the most significant collections in American history. Their website listed a phone number for inquiries. Clara stared at the phone number for a long time. Calling that number felt like crossing a line. As long as she kept the collection to herself, it existed in a state of possibility. It could be worth anything or nothing. It could be real, or it could be an old man's delusion. A lifetime of fakes and forgeries accumulated by someone who thought he knew what he was doing, but didn't. Calling the appraisers would collapse that uncertainty into a single, definitive answer, and Clara wasn't sure she was ready for that answer, whatever it turned out to be. But she called anyway, because she was Clara Whitfield, and Clara Whitfield did not stand still when there was a door in front of her, even when she was afraid of what was on the other side. The woman who answered the phone was professional and kind. Her name was Rebecca, and she worked in the firm's client intake department. Clara explained, as clearly as she could, that she had inherited a property that contained a collection of stamps, coins, historical documents, and artwork, and that she needed to have the collection assessed. Rebecca asked a few questions. How old were the items? Did Clara have any documentation or provenance records? How large was the collection? Clara answered as best she could. She mentioned the leather notebook with Arthur's entries. She mentioned the 1933 double eagle. She mentioned the Confederate stamps and the Civil War letters. She could hear Rebecca's tone shift as she spoke, the professional politeness giving way to something sharper and more attentive, the way a person's voice changes when they realize they are hearing something important. Rebecca asked Clara to hold for a moment. When she came back, she said that one of the firm's senior partners, a man named David Hargrove, would like to speak with Clara personally. Could she hold for another moment? Clara held. The library's wall clock ticked. Somewhere, a printer hummed. And then a man's voice came on the line, calm and measured, with the kind of authority that comes from decades of expertise. Mrs. Whitfield, my name is David Hargrove. I'm a senior partner here at Hargrove and Associates. Rebecca has shared the preliminary details of your inquiry with me, and I'd like to ask you a few more questions, if that's all right. Clara said it was all right. David Hargrove asked careful, specific questions. He asked about the condition of the stamps, how they had been stored, whether they showed signs of moisture damage or foxing. He asked about the coins, whether they were in original mint packaging or later holders, whether they showed signs of cleaning or alteration. He asked about the documents, whether they were in acid-free storage, whether the paper showed signs of deterioration, whether the ink was still legible. He asked about the paintings, their size, their medium, whether there were signatures visible. Clara answered each question based on what she had seen, and with each answer, the silence on the other end of the line grew a fraction longer, as if David Hargrove was recalibrating his expectations in real time. Finally, he asked a question that made Clara's breath catch. Mrs. Whitfield, you mentioned a 1933 double eagle. Can you tell me exactly what the label on the case says? Clara had memorized it. It says, 1933 double eagle, St. Gaudens, one of 20 known specimens. The silence on the line lasted a full 5 seconds. Mrs. Whitfield, David Hargrove said, and his voice was very steady, the way a surgeon's hands are steady. I would like to come see this collection personally. Would next week be acceptable? Clara said next week would be fine. I'll be bringing a small team, he continued. An authentication specialist, a conservator, and a cataloger. We will need to spend several hours examining the collection, possibly more than one day depending on the scope. Is that acceptable? Clara said it was. And Mrs. Whitfield? I need to emphasize something. If what you've described is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, then I strongly recommend that you do not discuss this collection with anyone until we've had a chance to examine it. Not family, not friends, not neighbors. No one. Do you understand? Clara said she understood. After she hung up, she sat in the library for another 10 minutes, staring at the phone in her hand. The world around her continued in its ordinary way. People checked out books and returned them. Children argued over who got to use the computer next. A librarian reshelved a cart of novels with quiet efficiency. Nobody looked at Clara. Nobody knew that the woman sitting at the corner desk, in her thrift store jacket and her worn-out shoes, had just set in motion a process that would reveal one of the most significant private collections of American artifacts discovered in the 21st century. Clara went back to work. She stocked shelves and rang up customers and smiled at Dorothy and said nothing about the phone call or the safe or the letters or any of it. She went home and cooked dinner and bathed the children and read them stories and lay in bed that night, listening to the house settle around her, on the creaks and groans of old wood adjusting to the cold, and she thought about David Hargrove and his team of specialists coming to her cabin next week to look at what Arthur Redmond had left behind. The week passed with agonizing slowness. Clara went through the motions of her daily routine while carrying a secret that felt like a physical weight in her chest, something heavy and warm and slightly terrifying that she couldn't put down or share with anyone. She thought about telling Patricia, but the imagined conversation always ended badly in her mind. Patricia would either not believe her or would believe her too much, and either reaction would be unbearable. She thought about telling her father, but her father had never believed in Clara's judgment, and she couldn't bear the thought of hearing doubt in his voice when she was holding something so fragile and precious. So she said nothing. On Wednesday, David Hargrove called to confirm, and he and his team would arrive on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. He asked for the address and directions, and Clara gave them, feeling slightly absurd as she described the dirt road and the unmarked turn and the driveway hidden behind a stand of pines. She could almost hear Hargrove recalculating his assumptions about the kind of place that might house a significant collection. Thursday night, Clara cleaned the cabin from top to bottom. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, washed the windows, dusted every surface, and arranged the furniture so that the small living room felt as spacious and presentable as possible. She knew it was ridiculous. She knew that a team of art and antiquities specialists from Washington, D.C., had seen far grander settings than a one-bedroom cabin in the West Virginia mountains. But she couldn't help it. She was a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, and she refused to give anyone another reason to look past her. She arranged for a neighbor down the road, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Hadley, who had taken a liking to Elijah and Naya, to watch the children after school on Friday. She didn't explain why. Mrs. Hadley, who was the kind of woman who helped first and asked questions later, simply said, of course, and packed an afternoon bag with snacks and coloring books. Friday morning dawned cold and bright, with frost on the grass and a sky so blue it looked artificial. Clara was up by 5, undressed and ready by 6, pacing the cabin by 7, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee by 8. At 8:45, she heard the sound of tires on gravel, and a black SUV appeared at the end of the driveway, moving slowly, carefully, as if the people inside weren't sure they had the right address. The SUV parked beside Clara's truck, and 4 people got out. David Hargrove was immediately recognizable as the person in charge. A tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested a lifetime of careful attention to detail. He wore a dark overcoat and leather shoes that looked expensive but practical. Behind him came a woman in her 40s, carrying a large case, a younger man with a camera bag, and another man in a tweed jacket, who looked like a college professor. David Hargrove extended his hand to Clara and introduced himself formally, then introduced his team. The woman was Dr. Sarah Chen, an authentication specialist who focused on historical documents and philatelic items. The young man was Marcus Webb, who handled photographic documentation and condition reporting. The man in the tweed jacket was Dr. James Fairbanks, a numismatist, which Clara gathered meant he was an expert in coins. Clara shook each hand and invited them inside. She could see them taking in the cabin as they entered, their eyes moving across the small rooms, the wood-burning stove, the patched roof, the windows with their plastic sheeting. She could see the recalculation happening behind their professional expressions, the adjustment of expectations as they compared the modesty of the cabin with the description Clara had given over the phone. She let them look. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, not yet. She offered coffee, which they accepted, and while the kettle heated on the propane stove, she showed them the leather notebook. One shifted behind his eyes, a tightening, a shifted behind his eyes, a tightening, a focusing, the way a lens adjusts when it finds its subject. He looked up from the notebook and met Clara's eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield, shall we see the collection?" Clara led them to the hallway. She pulled the chair into position, opened the hatch, and extended the ladder. For David Hargrove looked up at the opening, then at Clara, and she could see the question in his eyes, the same question everyone always had when they looked at her life and her circumstances and her decisions. How could this be real? "After you," Clara said. They climbed one by one into the attic. Clara had placed battery-powered lanterns around the space that morning, and the attic was better lit than it had been during her previous visits. In the improved light, the full scope of Arthur's collection was visible for the first time. The boxes and crates and trunks arranged along the walls, the safe on its table in the center, and the sheer volume of items stored in a space no bigger than the cabin below it. There was a moment of silence. Clara would remember that silence for the rest of her life, the way it fell over the 4 specialists like a curtain, heavy and complete, as they stood in the attic and looked at what Arthur Redmond had built. It was Doctor, and parted. "This is organized by Scott," parted. "This is organized by Scott catalog number," she said quietly, almost to herself. "The storage conditions are exceptional. Acid-free sleeves, climate-stable environment, minimal light exposure." She straightened up and looked at David Hargrove. "David, I need to spend time with this." Doctor. Fairbanks had moved to the safe, which Clara had left closed. She gave him the combination, and he opened it with the reverence of a man opening a reliquary. He picked up the first coin case, the double eagle, and held it under one of the lanterns. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he set it down and picked up the next case, and the next, and the next, working his way through the shelf with the slow, deliberate care of someone who understood that he was handling history. Marcus Webb was already photographing. His camera clicked softly in the silence, capturing the attic, the safe, the albums, the boxes, the light falling through the grimy window onto decades of hidden treasure. David Hargrove stood in the center of the attic and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing by the hatch, watching them work, and he said something that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and his voice was very calm, the calm of a man who had spent his career dealing in extraordinary things and had learned that the most extraordinary of all were the ones that came from the most unexpected places. "I believe we're going to be here for more than one day." They were there for 3 days. David Hargrove called his office on Friday afternoon and cleared his schedule for the following week. Dr. Chen requested additional supplies from D.C. and had them overnighted to the post office in the next town. Dr. Fairbanks spent the first day with the coins alone, sitting at a folding table Clara set up in the attic, examining each specimen under a jeweler's loupe, making notes in a leather-bound journal of his own. Marcus Webb shot more than 3,000 photographs over the 3 days, documenting every item, every label, every page of every album. Clara worked her shift at the general store on Saturday and Sunday, leaving the team to their work. She gave them keys to the cabin and permission to access the attic at will, and she came home each evening to find them still working, surrounded by open albums and coin cases and archival folders, speaking to each other in the hushed, precise language of people who know they are in the presence of something significant. On Sunday evening, after the team had packed up their equipment for the night and were preparing to drive to the motel in the next town, I flat on the surface and looked at her, with 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 her, cool, with her, 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 truth flat on the surface, and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe as the face of a man trying to deliver news that he himself was still processing. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I need to be careful here, because we haven't completed our full assessment. And there's still work to be done in terms of authentication and provenance verification. Some of the items in this collection will require extended analysis, and a few will need to be examined by outside specialists. I don't want to give you a number that might change." Clara nodded. She had learned patience from Arthur's notebook, from his careful handwriting, from his decades of quiet accumulation. She could wait for precision. "That said," David Hargrove continued, "I can tell you this. What is in your attic is one of the most remarkable private collections I have encountered in my career. The stamps alone, based on Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment, represent a collection of extraordinary depth and rarity, including several specimens that we believe may be unique or near unique. The coins include items that, if authenticated, would rank among the most valuable numismatic specimens in private hands. And the documents," he paused, choosing his words. "The documents include correspondence that appears to be of significant historical importance, including materials that major institutions would compete to acquire." Clara waited. "Our preliminary estimate," David Hargrove said, "and I emphasize that this is preliminary and subject to revision following full authentication, is that the total value of the collection is in excess of $200 million. It could be substantially higher. It is unlikely to be lower. $200 million. Clara heard the number. She understood the number. She could feel the number settling into her bones like a change in weather, something vast and atmospheric and impossible to ignore. But she didn't react the way people in movies react to that kind of news. She didn't scream or cry or faint or jump up from the table. She sat very still, her hands in her lap, her eyes on David Hargrove's face, and she thought about Arthur Redmond, alone in this cabin for 60 years, building something beautiful in secret, and her mother, 19 years old, bringing wildflowers to a man who had forgotten what beauty looked like. "Thank you," Clara said. "What happens next?" David Hargrove looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, as if he had expected hysterics, and received instead the quiet steadiness of a woman who had survived things harder than this, and would survive this too. "Next," he said, "we begin the formal authentication process. It will take time, weeks for some items, months for others. We'll need to verify provenance, confirm authenticity, and prepare detailed condition reports. During that process, I strongly recommend that the collection remain exactly where it is. This attic has preserved it beautifully for decades, and moving it prematurely could cause damage." Clara agreed. She also asked about security, which prompted David Hargrove to make a phone call that resulted in a private security firm arriving the following Tuesday to install a discreet but comprehensive alarm system in the cabin and attic. The security firm also recommended reinforcing the attic hatch and installing a fire suppression system, both of which were arranged and paid for by Hargrove and Associates as part of their standard service for high-value collections. Clara didn't tell Patricia. She didn't tell her father. She didn't tell Dorothy or Earl or anyone in Meadow Creek. She went to work and came home and cooked dinner and helped with homework and lived her life exactly as she had been living it, in the cabin that everyone said was worthless, on the property that everyone said was a dead end, with the secret of Arthur Redmond's fortune hidden above her head like a second sky. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially in small towns, especially when a black SUV with DC on plates shows up at a mountain cabin and stays for 3 days. Dorothy at the general store mentioned to Clara, casually, that someone had seen city people at her place. Earl at the gas station asked if she was having the cabin inspected, which was a reasonable assumption, but still made Clara's pulse jump. She deflected both questions with vague answers about a property assessment, which was technically true, and hoped that the curiosity would fade. It didn't fade. It grew. Well, because small towns run on information the way engines run on fuel, and the arrival of 4 well-dressed strangers at the cabin of the woman everyone had written off as foolish was exactly the kind of fuel that kept the engine running hot. If you are enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next, because what happens when Clara's secret finally comes to light is something that no one in Meadow Creek, not Patricia, not Earl, and not Dorothy, not even Clara herself could have predicted. And it changes everything. Patricia called on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after David Hargrove's visit. Clara was washing dishes, and Naya was drawing at the kitchen table, and Elijah was reading a book by the fire, and everything was normal and quiet and safe in the way that Clara had come to love about her life in the cabin. Then the phone rang, and Patricia's voice came through the speaker with the sharp and probing tone that Clara recognized as her sister's investigation mode. "Clara," Patricia said, "who were the people at your cabin? And don't tell me it was a property assessment, because I already checked, and there's no assessment on file with the county." Clara should have been prepared for this. She should have had a story ready, an explanation that would satisfy Patricia's curiosity without revealing anything she wasn't ready to share. But she wasn't prepared, because she had been living inside the miracle of Arthur's collection for 2 weeks, carrying it alone, and the weight of the secret had made her tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "It's nothing," Clara said. "Just some people I hired to look at the house." "What people? From where?" "Clara, Earl said they had government plates." "They weren't government. They were from a company in D.C. that does property evaluations." "A company in D.C. for an $800 cabin, who never let anything go. Lying to who never let anything go. Lying to Patricia was like trying to hold water in your fists. It leaked no matter how tight you squeezed. "Patricia," Clara said, "I promise you, when there's something to tell, I will tell you. But right now, I need you to trust me." The silence on the line was long and heavy with the weight of every argument they had ever had. Every time Patricia had been right and Clara had been wrong. Every time Patricia had predicted disaster and disaster had arrived. But for once, Patricia didn't push. Maybe it was something in Clara's voice. Maybe it was the steadiness of it, the quiet certainty that hadn't been there before, the sound of a woman who was standing on solid ground for the first time in her life. "Fine," Patricia said, "but I'm keeping my eye on this." "I know you are," Clara said. "You always do." She hung up the phone and stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the mountains, dark against the darkening sky, and she thought about what was coming. The authentication would take weeks. The appraisal would take longer. And when it was done, when the numbers were final and the truth was undeniable, Clara would have to tell the people in her life what she had found. So she would have to tell Patricia and her father and Dorothy and Earl and everyone who had laughed at her or pitied her or told her she was making a mistake. She would have to tell them that the $800 cabin they had dismissed as worthless contained a fortune worth $250 million. And she would have to do it without losing herself in the process. Clara dried her hands on a dish towel, kissed Naya on the forehead, told Elijah it was almost bedtime, and went to sit on the porch for a few minutes before the evening routine took over. The stars were out, thick and bright above the mountains, and the air smelled like pine and wood smoke and the coming winter. She wrapped her arms around herself and breathed. Somewhere above her, through the roof and the ceiling and the attic hatch that had been painted shut for years, Arthur Redmond's collection waited. Patient. Beautiful. Worth more than anyone had ever imagined. like Clara herself. The authentication process took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of phone calls and emails and FedEx packages containing photographs and condition reports and documents that Clara signed in triplicate without fully understanding the legal language, but trusting David Hargrove because he had earned her trust through patience and precision, which were the two qualities Clara valued most in the world, because they were the qualities her mother had taught her and the qualities Arthur Redmond had lived by: are to school and help with homework, and cook to school and help with homework, and cook dinner on a propane stove in a cabin that the county had assessed at $800. She continued to be the woman that Meadow Creek had decided she was, the single mother who had made a foolish decision, of condescension that small towns reserve of condescension that small towns reserve for people who don't know their place. She let them think all of it, because Clara had learned something in those 11 weeks that was worth more than anything in Arthur's safe. Unjudged by appearances because it couldn't judged by appearances because it couldn't be bothered to look deeper. Clara had spent her whole life listening to that noise, letting it shape her decisions, letting it shrink her sense of what was possible. She wasn't listening anymore. David Hargrove called every Friday with updates. The stamps were being examined by a team at the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, where Dr. Chen had colleagues who specialized in Confederate-era philately. The coins had been sent, under armed guard, to the Professional Coin Grading Service in California for formal grading and authentication. The documents were being reviewed by a historian at the Library of Congress who specialized in Civil War correspondence and had nearly fallen out of his chair, according to David Hargrove, when he read the first letter from Gettysburg. Each Friday brought new information, and each piece of information added another layer to the portrait of Arthur Redmond that Clara was assembling in her mind. He had not been a hoarder or a gambler or a lucky fool who stumbled into valuable things by accident. He had been a scholar, a connoisseur, so a man of extraordinary knowledge and taste who had spent 60 years methodically building one of the most significant private collections of American historical artifacts that anyone had ever seen. He had attended auctions and estate sales across the eastern United States for decades. He had corresponded with dealers and collectors and historians. He had studied catalogs and price guides and academic journals. And he had done all of it quietly, anonymously, or from a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, where no one knew his name and no one cared what he did. The irony was not lost on Clara. Arthur had been dismissed by his neighbors, the same way Clara had been dismissed by hers. He had been the strange old man on the hill. She was the foolish single mother in the shack. Both of them had been underestimated, overlooked, written off by people who couldn't see past the surface of things. And both of them, in their own way and in their own time, I had proved those people wrong. The call came on a Thursday in late January, breaking the pattern of Friday updates. Clara was at the general store, restocking canned goods on aisle 3, when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She stepped into the back room and answered. "Mrs. Whitfield," David Hargrove said, and something in his voice was different. Not the calm, measured tone she had come to expect. Something lighter. Something that almost sounded like wonder. "So we've completed the authentication, all of it. Every item in the collection has been verified, graded, and assessed. I have the final numbers." Clara leaned against the wall of the stockroom, surrounded by boxes of paper towels and cases of soup, and closed her eyes. "Tell me." "The stamp collection has been authenticated as one of the finest private holdings of Confederate-era postal history in existence. Dr. Chen's team identified 17 specimens that are unique, meaning no other examples are known to exist. The total appraised value of the stamps is $61.3 million. Clara's knees went soft. She pressed her back harder against the wall and kept her eyes closed. The numismatic collection contains 47 coins of investment grade or higher, including the 1933 Double Eagle, which has been authenticated and graded MS-65 by PCGS. Dr. Fairbanks has described it as the finest known specimen. The total appraised value of the coins is $94.7 million. Clara's hand found the edge of a shelf and gripped it. The historical documents include 31 pieces of authenticated Civil War correspondence, including a previously unknown letter from a Union officer describing the events at Gettysburg in extraordinary detail. The Library of Congress has described this letter as one of the most significant finds in Civil War scholarship in the past 50 years. The total appraised value of the documents is $52.8 million. Clara opened her eyes. The stockroom was still there, the boxes of paper towels, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the ordinary world carrying on. The paintings, which were authenticated by a team Dr. Chen assembled from the National Gallery, include 3 works attributed to artists of significant standing, one of which is a previously unrecorded portrait that has been tentatively attributed to a major American portraitist of the mid-19th century. The total appraised value of the artwork is $36.4 million. David Hargrove paused. Clara could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and she realized that he too was affected by what he was saying, that this was not routine for him, that even a man who had spent his career handling extraordinary things was moved by the scale of what Arthur Redmond had assembled. The total appraised value of the Arthur Redmond collection, David Hargrove said, is $245.2 million. $245 million. $245,200,000. Hidden in the attic of an $800 cabin on 40 acres of mountain land in Boone County, West Virginia. So collected over 60 years by a man who lived alone and spoke to almost no one, and was remembered by his neighbors, when they remembered him at all, as peculiar. "Mrs. Whitfield," David Hargrove said, "are you still there?" "I'm here," Clara said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and distant, like it was coming from the other side of the stockroom rather than from her own throat. "I'm here, I'm at work." "I understand," David Hargrove said, and the warmth in his voice told her that he did understand, that he knew she was standing in a stockroom making $9.50 an hour while being told she was worth $250 million, and that the absurdity and the beauty of that juxtaposition was not lost on him. "We can discuss the details whenever you're ready. There's no rush." Clara thanked him and hung up and stood in the stockroom for several minutes, breathing, feeling the solid wall behind her back and the solid floor beneath her feet, anchoring herself to the physical world while her mind tried to absorb a number that was too large to hold. Then she straightened her apron, picked up a case of canned tomatoes, and went back to aisle 3. She finished her shift. She drove to Mrs. Hadley's house and picked up the children. She drove home, made macaroni and cheese, helped Elijah with his spelling words, gave Naya a bath, read 2 chapters of a book about a mouse who sailed across the ocean, and tucked them both into bed. She did all of these things the way she always did them, with care and attention, and the steady, practiced competence of a woman who had been managing the impossible for years. And then, when the house was quiet and the fire was burning low, Clara sat at the kitchen table and called Patricia. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Clara, it's almost 10 o'clock. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Clara said. "I need to tell you something." The way Clara told it later, she didn't plan what to say. She didn't rehearse a speech or organize her thoughts or try to build to a dramatic reveal. She just started talking. She told Patricia about Arthur's notebook, about the attic hatch painted shut, about the safe with the combination dial, about the letters between their mother and Arthur, the summer of 1988. The wildflowers, the combination hidden in the story of a friendship that neither of them had known about. She told her about opening the safe and seeing the stamps and the coins and the Civil War letters, about the library and the internet searches, about calling Hargrove and Associates, about the 3 days the team spent in the attic, about the 11 weeks of authentication, about the call she had received that afternoon in the stockroom of the general store. And then she told her the number. The silence on Patricia's end of the line lasted so long that Clara checked her phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. It hadn't. Patricia was still there. She was just quiet, which was something Patricia almost never was. A silence so unusual and so complete that it told Clara more about her sister's state of mind than any words could have. "Say that again," Patricia said finally. $245 million, Clara said. Another silence. Then Patricia made a sound that Clara had never heard from her before, a kind of strangled exhale that was half laugh and half sob, the sound of a person whose entire framework for understanding the world has just been picked up and shaken. "Clara," Patricia said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Are you serious?" "I'm serious. The cabin, the $800 cabin, the one I told you not to take, the one Dad said was a dead end. That's the one." Patricia was crying now. Clara could hear it, the wet, ragged breathing, the sniffling, the attempt to compose herself, and the failure to do so. And Clara understood, because she had done her own crying, quietly, alone, in the weeks since she first opened the safe. She had cried not because she was sad, but because the distance between where she had been and where she was going was so vast that the only way to cross it was through tears. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said. "You don't." "I do. I told you it was worthless. I told you to sell it and move on. I told you." "Patricia, you told me what you thought was true. You were trying to protect me. I know that. But I was wrong." "Yes," Clara said simply. "You were wrong. But so was I, about a lot of things, for a lot of years. Being wrong isn't a crime. Staying wrong is. And you won't stay wrong. I know you." Patricia cried harder, and Clara let her, on holding the phone to her ear and listening to her sister process the news the way a flood processes a landscape, destroying and renewing at the same time. They stayed on the phone for over an hour, talking and crying and laughing and talking some more. And by the time they said goodnight, something between them had shifted. Not just the dynamic of older sister and younger sister, of the responsible one and the reckless one. Something deeper. So a recognition that Clara had done something extraordinary, not by luck or by accident, but by choosing to believe in a possibility that everyone else had rejected, and by having the patience to see it through. Clara's father was harder. She drove to Ridgemont the following weekend, left the children with Patricia, who had driven up from Charlotte specifically for this purpose, and who hugged Clara so tightly at the door that Clara thought her ribs might crack, and went to her father's apartment. He was sitting in his recliner, watching television, when she arrived. He looked older than she remembered, smaller, as if the months since she had seen him had compressed him somehow, shrinking him into the chair. She sat on the couch across from him and told him everything. She told it the same way she had told Patricia, from the beginning, methodically, without embellishment or drama. Her father listened without interrupting, his face impassive, his eyes on her face with the same flat, assessing gaze that had made Clara feel small her entire life. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he reached for the remote and turned off the television, which was something Clara had never seen him do voluntarily. The apartment went silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of traffic outside. "Your mother," he said. She knew this man. She spent a summer in Meadow Creek. She wrote to him. They were friends. She never mentioned it. She never mentioned a lot of things. She was a private person. Her father looked at his hands, spread flat on the armrests of his chair, and Clara could see something moving behind his eyes, something complicated and old and hard. The recalibration of a man who had built his understanding of the world on certain assumptions and was now watching those assumptions dissolve. "I told you it was a dead end," he said. "No, you did. I was wrong." Coming from her father, those 3 words were like a crack in a dam. Not a flood, not yet, but the beginning of one. The first fracture in a wall that had stood between them for years. Clara didn't push it. She didn't demand more. She accepted what he gave, which was 3 words and the look in his eyes that accompanied them. A look that was not quite pride, but was closer to it than anything she had seen from him before. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. I'm going to take care of my children," Clara said. "And I'm going to honor the man who trusted me with it." Her father nodded slowly. "Your mother would be proud of you." Clara stood up and kissed him on the forehead, which was something she hadn't done since she was a child. And he let her, which was something he hadn't done since she was a child. And they stood together in the small apartment for a moment that felt like the closing of a very long chapter and the opening of a new one. The news spread through Meadow Creek the way fire spreads through dry grass. Clara didn't announce it publicly, but David Hargrove's firm issued a press release about the discovery of the Arthur Redmond collection, because a find of this significance couldn't remain hidden, not when the Smithsonian was involved, and the Library of Congress was involved, and auction houses on 3 continents were already making inquiries. The press release didn't mention Clara's name, but in a town of 400 people, it took approximately 1 day for everyone to connect the dots between the significant private collection discovered in Boone County and the single mother who had moved into Arthur Redmond's cabin 6 months ago. Dorothy was the first to say something. Clara was at work, stalking the same aisle she had been stalking the day David Hargrove called with the final numbers. Well, when Dorothy came around the corner and stood there looking at Clara with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and something that might have been shame. "Clara," Dorothy said, "is it true?" Clara straightened up and met Dorothy's eyes. "What have you heard?" "Everything. The whole town's heard. Arthur Redmond's cabin. A collection worth... Well, people are saying different numbers, but they're all very large numbers." Clara nodded. "Oh, it's true." Dorothy leaned against the shelf and pressed her hand to her chest. "Lord, have mercy," she said, which was her response to everything from a flat tire to a presidential election. But in this case, she said it with such genuine bewilderment that Clara almost smiled. "Dorothy," Clara said, "I need to give you my 2 weeks' notice." Dorothy laughed, and then she cried. And then she hugged Clara right there in aisle 3, surrounded by canned tomatoes and boxes of pasta, and told her that she was the most extraordinary person Dorothy had ever met, and that she was sorry, truly sorry, for every doubtful thing she had ever said or thought. Earl at the gas station found out next. Clara stopped for fuel on her way home from work, and Earl came out of the office the way he always did, slow and deliberate, with his hands in his pockets and his cap pulled low. But this time, instead of the usual small talk about the weather or the price of propane, he stood by her truck and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was respect. Pure, unguarded, slightly stunned respect. "I heard about the cabin," he said. "I figured you would. Arthur Redmond was sitting on all that? All these years?" "All these years," Earl shook his head slowly. "And we all thought..." He trailed off as if finishing the sentence would require admitting something he wasn't quite ready to admit. You all thought I was foolish for moving there, Clara finished for him. It's okay, Earl. I would have thought the same thing. No, Earl said. You wouldn't have. That's the difference. He tipped his cap to her, which was something he did for nobody, and went back inside. Word moved through Meadow Creek like a current through water, touching everything it reached and leaving nothing unchanged. At the diner on Route 3, where the morning regulars gathered over coffee and eggs and the daily business of knowing everybody else's business, Clara's name was the only topic of conversation for 3 straight weeks. The woman from the booth by the window, who used to whisper about the foolish city girl, had gone very quiet. The man who ran the hardware store, who had once told Clara that Arthur's cabin wasn't worth the nails holding it together, showed up at her door with a casserole and an apology, on both of which Clara accepted with equal grace. Mrs. Hadley, the retired schoolteacher who had watched Elijah and Naya on the day the appraisers came, called Clara one evening and said in her straightforward way, "I always knew you were something special, Clara, not because of the money, because of the way you treat those children. The money just proves the universe has been paying attention." Clara hung that sentence in her mind, the way she had hung Arthur's painting above her fireplace, seen as something worth looking at every day. The pastor of the small white church where Clara had taken the children reached out, not to ask for a donation, which Clara had expected and braced herself for, but to tell her that he had known Arthur Redmond slightly, having visited him twice in his final years, when a neighbor mentioned the old man might appreciate some company. Arthur had been polite but private, the pastor said, and had asked only one question during both visits. I nodded and said, "Good." Then it wasn't nodded and said, "Good." Then it wasn't wasted. Clara thought about that story for a long time. She thought about it when she was driving, and when she was cooking, and when she was lying in bed at night, listening to the house settle around her. Kindness not wasted, a man's entire philosophy, distilled into 4 words, he validated by a fortune left to the daughter of the one person who had shown him that philosophy was true. The news reached Derek through Patricia, who told him because she felt he should hear it from family rather than from the internet, where the story was beginning to circulate in collector communities and history blogs. Derek called Clara that evening, and his voice had the particular quality that Clara recognized as his trying to be charming voice, the voice he used when he wanted something. "Why, Clara, that's incredible news," he said. "I always knew that cabin had potential. Remember, I said you should check the place out." He had said nothing of the sort. He had texted her a threat about custody. Clara remembered every word, because she had learned a long time ago to remember the things people said when they thought they had power over you, so that when the balance shifted, as it always eventually did, you would know exactly who they were. "Derek," she said, "why, let me be very clear about something. This changes nothing between us. You are the father of my children, and I will always facilitate your relationship with them. But this fortune is mine. It was left to me by a man who trusted my mother's memory enough to entrust it to her daughter. You have no claim to it, legal or otherwise. And the next time you want to threaten me with a custody lawyer, I want you to remember that I can now afford lawyers you've never heard of. Are we clear?" Derek was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "We're clear." "Good. Elijah has a school play next month. You should come." She hung up and felt something release in her chest, something she had been carrying for years without knowing its name. It was the weight of being powerless, the weight of knowing that someone could threaten you and you couldn't fight back. Not because you were wrong, but because you were poor, and poor people didn't get to fight back. That weight was gone now. Not because money had made her a better person, but because money had given her the one thing she had always deserved and never had: a level playing field. In the weeks that followed, Clara made decisions. She made them carefully, deliberately, with the same patience that Arthur had practiced in building his collection, and the same steadiness that her mother had demonstrated in her kindness to a lonely old man on a mountain. She hired a financial advisor recommended by David Hargrove, a woman named Catherine Park, who specialized in managing sudden wealth and who treated Clara not as a lottery winner, but as a client, which was exactly what Clara needed. Together, they developed a plan, a trust for Elijah and Naya, structured to provide for their education and their future without spoiling them or giving them access to amounts of money they were too young to understand, on a fund for the preservation of Arthur's cabin and the surrounding property, which Clara intended to maintain as a tribute to the man who had built the collection. A charitable foundation, named after Margaret Whitfield, that would provide educational scholarships to first-generation college students from rural communities. The first scholarship was awarded to a young woman from Meadow Creek who worked weekends at the gas station Earl owned and who wanted to study nursing. Clara handed her the letter personally, and the young woman cried. And Clara cried. And Earl, who was watching from across the parking lot because he couldn't help himself, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended he had gotten dust in them. Clara did not move out of the cabin. This surprised everyone, including Patricia, who offered to help her find a house in Charlotte, and David Hargrove, who gently suggested that a woman of her means might prefer accommodations with indoor plumbing. Clara listened to their suggestions and appreciated them and declined. She did, however, invest in substantial renovations. The well was repaired and the plumbing restored. The electrical system was upgraded. The roof was replaced with proper materials. A second bedroom was added for the children, and the kitchen was expanded to include modern appliances. But the bones of the cabin remained the same. On the wood-burning fireplace, the porch with the view of the mountains, the attic hatch in the hallway, now reinforced with steel and connected to a state-of-the-art security system, but still there, still the same hatch that Clara had opened with trembling hands on a November night. She kept working at the general store for 3 more weeks after giving notice, because she had told Dorothy 2 weeks, and Clara Whitfield kept her word. On her last day, Ma Dorothy gave her a card signed by every employee and regular customer, and Clara cried for the first time in front of other people since the whole thing began. The Arthur Redmond collection was eventually divided between several destinations. The stamps were acquired by a consortium of museums and private collectors, with the 17 unique specimens going to the Smithsonian on a long-term loan that Clara insisted on rather than an outright sale, because she felt that Arthur would have wanted his stamps to be seen and studied, not locked in a private vault. The coins were sold at auction through Christie's over the course of 3 separate sales that generated headlines in collector publications around the world. The 1933 Double Eagle alone sold for $22.3 million, a record for the denomination. The Civil War documents were donated to the Library of Congress, with Clara declining the tax benefits because she didn't need them and because she wanted the donation to be what it was, a gift given freely in the spirit of the man who had preserved those letters for decades. At the donation ceremony in Washington, which Clara attended wearing a dress Patricia had helped her pick out and shoes that didn't come from a thrift store for the first time in years, the head archivist spoke about the significance of the Gettysburg letter and its potential to reshape scholarly understanding of a pivotal moment in American history. He thanked Clara for her generosity, and Clara stood at the podium and said the only thing that felt true. She said, "This gift isn't from me. It's from Arthur Redmond, who spent his life saving things the world had forgotten. And it's from my mother, Margaret Whitfield, who spent her life being kind to people the world had overlooked. I'm just the person who carried it from one place to another." She sat down, and the room was quiet for a moment, and then someone began to clap, and then everyone was clapping, and Clara sat there in her new dress, with her hands folded in her lap, and thought about her mother bringing wildflowers to a lonely man in a mountain store in the summer of 1988, and how that one small act had led to this moment, in this room, a work of a renowned American artist, whose paintings, hung in major museums across the country, was sold privately for $14 million to a collector who promised, at Clara's request, to make it available for public exhibition. Clara kept one painting for herself, a small landscape of mountains and wildflowers that Arthur had not acquired, but had painted himself, according to a note on the back in his handwriting. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was not worth millions. But it hung above the fireplace in Clara's cabin, and every time she looked at it, she saw the mountains outside her window reflected in the brushstrokes of a man who had loved beauty enough to spend his life surrounded by it. The total proceeds from the collection, after authentication costs, auction commissions, legal fees, conservation expenses, and taxes, exceeded $180 million in liquid assets, with the remaining value preserved in the items Clara had donated or loaned to institutions. It was, by any measure, a fortune beyond anything Clara had imagined possible when she stood in Helen Marsh's office and heard that she had inherited a property assessed at $800. But the number, as large as it was not the thing that mattered most. Not to Clara. What mattered most was what the number represented. Not wealth, but recognition. The recognition that Arthur Redmond had been extraordinary, that Margaret Whitfield's kindness had mattered, that a single summer of letters and wildflowers and human connection had created a bond strong enough to survive 3 decades and deliver a gift that would change a family's life forever. And what mattered most of all, if Clara was being honest, so was the moment she sat down with Elijah and Naya and explained, in terms they could understand, what had happened. She told them about Arthur, the quiet old man who lived in their cabin before them. She told them about Grandma Margaret, who had been kind to Arthur when nobody else was. She told them about the safe in the attic and the treasures inside it, and how those treasures meant that they would never have to worry about having a home, or going to school, or having enough food on the table. See, Elijah, who was 7 and understood more than people gave him credit for, listened carefully, and then asked, "Was Arthur lonely?" Clara thought about that. She thought about the cabin and the silence, and the 60 years of solitary collecting, and the letters that Arthur had kept in his safe alongside stamps worth millions and coins worth tens of millions. She thought about the note in his notebook, addressed to no one in particular, but written with the intimacy of trust. I think he was sometimes," Clara said, "but I think your grandmother made him less lonely, and I think leaving us his collection was his way of saying thank you." Elijah thought about this, his brow furrowed the way it always did when he was working through something important. So Grandma was nice to him, and he remembered it forever. "Forever," Clara said. "That means being nice is the most important thing," Elijah said, with the absolute certainty that only a 7-year-old can muster, and Clara felt something tighten in her chest because he was right. He was exactly, perfectly, completely right, and he had arrived at it the way children arrive at truth, not through analysis, but through the pure, uncomplicated logic of a heart that hasn't learned to doubt itself yet. Naya, who was 5 and understood the world primarily through feelings, climbed into Clara's lap and put her hands on Clara's face and said, "Can we go back to the attic?" Clara smiled and held her daughter close and said yes. They could go back to the attic. They could go back any time they wanted. The attic was theirs now, along with the cabin and the mountains and the porch, where Clara sat in the mornings and watched the sun come up over the hills and thought about how strange and beautiful life was, how it could turn on a single decision, a single letter, a single act of kindness offered to a person the world had forgotten. And if you've stayed with this story from the beginning, you know that it started with a woman who had nothing and ended with a woman who had everything. But the truth is more complicated than that. Clara Whitfield never had nothing. She had her children, she had her stubbornness, she had a mother who raised her to be kind, and a work ethic that wouldn't quit, and a refusal, bone deep and unshakable, to let the world tell her what she was worth. A value where others saw waste. We're not value where others saw waste. We're not weaknesses, but superpowers. Proof that kindness echoes across decades and finds its way back to the people who need it most. Proof that an $800 cabin in the mountains of West Virginia can hold a fortune, and that a single mother with 2 children and no money and no support and nothing but determination can be the one to find it. The cabin still stands on its 40 acres in Boone County. Clara still lives there, though the cabin is warm now, and the plumbing works, and the roof doesn't leak, and there is a new addition off the back where Elijah and Naya each have their own room. The porch still faces the mountains, and Clara still sits there in the mornings with her coffee, watching the sun come up, remembering the first time she saw this place and the voices that told her to turn around. She didn't turn around. She went forward, and everything changed. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the children are in bed, and the fire is burning low, and the mountains outside the window are dark shapes against a darker sky, Clara takes out her mother's letters and reads them again. Not for the combination, which she knows by heart now. 14, 9, 23. The numbers written into the story of her mother's summer, like a code hidden in plain sight. She reads them because they remind her of something that money can't buy and time can't diminish. They remind her that her mother saw people, really saw them, not their circumstances or their reputations or the stories the world told about them, but the human beings underneath all of that, with their loneliness and their beauty and their need to be noticed by someone who cared. Arthur Redmond was noticed by Margaret Whitfield. And because he was noticed, he was changed. And because he was changed, he left behind something extraordinary. And because he left it behind, Clara Whitfield and her children have a life that none of them could have imagined a year ago. That is the power of kindness. Not the soft, passive, easily dismissed kindness that the world pretends to value, while actually valuing money and power and status. Real kindness. Active kindness. The kindness that sees a lonely old man in a general store and thinks he deserves flowers. The kindness that writes a letter to a stranger because they looked like they needed someone to talk to. The kindness that crosses decades and distances and even death to deliver its promise. That is what Clara inherited, not $245 million, not stamps and coins and letters from Gettysburg. She inherited her mother's kindness, reflected back to her across 30 years by a man who never forgot it. And that inheritance, more than any fortune, is the one that will last. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the things the world dismisses as worthless might be the things worth fighting for, then subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing in front of their own $800 cabin for watching. And remember, the next time for watching. And remember, the next time someone laughs at what you've been given, don't let go of it. Hold on. Look closer. The treasure might be right above your head, waiting for you to find it.